Hey folks, welcome back to the EDM studio. Today I'm going to be talking about filters, and if you haven't had a chance to check out my video on signals yet, I'd highly recommend doing so because it ties in really nicely with the stuff that I'm going to talk about today. So we're talking about filters in Logic. There's really three kinds of filters that you'll run into. Those are low pass, high pass, and bandpass filters. And they all operate on kind of the same principles, and the understanding is actually pretty intuitive if my signals video made sense to you. So if you recall, what we talked about was how you can represent this sawtooth wave in the frequency domain in terms of its component frequencies, which occur at a bunch of harmonics of the fundamental. And we can actually represent any signal in this way. So when we go into the frequency domain, we can map out all of the frequency components that are present in that periodic signal. Now, let's consider a low-pass filter first. What a low-pass filter does is, in the ideal low-pass filter, it has what's called a cutoff frequency. And so let's just say that this is our cutoff frequency. A low-pass filter allows all frequencies that are less than the cutoff frequency to pass through the filter. So that's why it's called a low-pass filter. So basically, we would only see these low-frequency components, and all of these high-frequency components wouldn't be present in the signal after the filter. And what that ends up doing is it kind of rounds out the corners on your signal. So maybe rather than being this sharp sawtooth, it's kind of like a rounded or a more rounded signal. Similarly, a high-pass filter does exactly the same thing, except it passes frequencies that are higher than the cutoff frequency. So we don't get these low-frequency components, but we might get these really jagged parts of the signal. And then a bandpass filter, as you might have guessed, rather than passing filters that are lower than the frequency or higher, or lower than the cutoff frequency or higher than the cutoff frequency, it has basically two cutoff frequencies, and it passes through frequencies that are within the band and rejects frequencies that are outside of the band. So that's the intuitive understanding, but in the real world, it turns out that it's really difficult, or it's actually impossible to build a perfect low-pass or high-pass filter. So let's dive into Logic and see what these filters look like in the real world. All right, so here we are in Logic, and I've wired up my ESM to go through this autofilter. And we're going to ignore all these other parameters for now and just focus on the filter part of the autofilter. So that is this section here. And in terms of what we just talked about, I just highlight those two parameters. So those are the cutoff frequency, and then down here we have the type of filter. So we can set the cutoff frequency, and then we can set what type of filter: high pass, band pass, or low pass. And there are some other parameters on here: the resonance, fatness, and then this 4-pole low pass filter. So we'll talk about all three of those later, but I just want to kind of show what this looks like when we're doing this thing I just talked about on the board in Logic. So let's set this up so that we have the filter all the way open, and here we have a low pass filter but with a really high cutoff frequency, so the filter is basically open. And I'm going to play the sawtooth wave, and you can see here that we get the string of harmonic energy that we expect. So now what happens when we start lowering the cutoff frequency on the low pass filter? Well, the high frequencies start falling off. But notice that they don't fall off immediately. It sort of looks like they attenuate as you get higher, but it's not like there's just one hard cutoff frequency. Okay, so that's a low pass filter. High pass filter, basically the same thing. So I'll set the cutoff all the way on the low end, and that means that the filter is going to be open when we start. And then as I move up the cutoff frequency, it starts emphasizing higher and higher frequency components. Okay, and lastly, let's look at the bandpass filter. So interestingly, the perfect band, or the ideal bandpass filter, had two cutoff frequencies, and it passed frequencies that were within that band. Well, here we only have one. So what the filter is gonna look like is, rather than being this perfect cutoff on either end, it'll be the cutoff frequency is the center of the bandpass, and then the filter drops off gradually to either side in the frequency domain. So let's start with the cutoff frequency in the middle. And you'll see that we can kind of move around the frequencies that are emphasized. All right, so that's the bandpass filter. I think the important thing to take away from this is that in logic, these filters aren't ideal. And it turns out that the reason for that is it's impossible to build a perfect bandpass filter, because this translation involves signals that would be infinitely long. And I know that sounds a little bit hand-wavy, but essentially the operation that you do in order to do this conversion would require infinite space or infinite memory. So in practice, what we do is we approximate the filter, and I think that's what we're going to talk about now. So how good of an approximation can we create, and how do we measure the strength of the filter, the strength of the approximation?